Hi, welcome to Knitting Step by Step, the podcast that's going to teach you how to knit. I'm your host, Jason Block.
And I'm your knitting instructor, Ivy Reisner.
This is episode 1, the pilot episode. Before we get into knitting in earnest, we need to know who this podcast is aimed at, what people are going to get out of this podcast, and the structure of it. Who is this podcast going to be aimed at?
This is going to be aimed for a beginning knitter who wants to learn all the fundamental skills of knitting step by step.
Step by step. Each episode is going to teach about 1 or 2 different skills. We're going to build on those skills. When they're going to be eventually going to be knitting socks, lace, and even a multicolored hat. Now, the structure of the podcast is going to be 3 parts. The first part is the project itself. You're going to teach them and tell them where they're supposed to be at each part of the project. The second part is your part, where you're going to teach them how to knit and how to get that part, the skills. Third part is the interactive thing, where you answer questions that they ask you, which is, of course, how are they going to ask you those questions?
You can email me at ivy@knittingstepbystep.com or go to the website knittingstepbystep.com and leave a comment on the blog. Now, I won't promise that every question is going to be answered on the podcast, but I will promise that every question is going to be answered. If you send me an email, if you leave me a blog comment, you will get a response, guaranteed. Also on the website is going to be the pattern and an episode guide and show notes with relevant links and other additional information.
Okay, so let's get into the second part, which is going to be what we're going to do and what you're going to need for it. Now, the project you said is a garter stitch scarf. Mm-hmm. Now, what materials are they going to need?
It's very simple. They're going to need size 8 US or 5 millimeter knitting needles, and they're going to need about 400 meters of a worsted weight yarn.
Now, needles come basically in 2 forms. This one, which is what?
These are your basic straight needles. They are the most traditional form. They can come very fancy. They can come very plain. They can be less expensive than the circular needles, and they aren't quite as flexible in terms of their application. They're just used for knitting back and forth, but they're fantastic for this project.
Now, the second type is the more flexible kind, which are known as circular needles, because you can knit in the round or a longer stitch.
Exactly. You can keep the stitches all along the cable and have a much wider project going. Now, circular needles are more flexible in terms of their function. They can do a lot more things, but they also tend to be a little more expensive. For this project, either one is fine.
Now, when people go into a yarn store, they can encounter them how many different ways?
They're going to find yarn either in balls or in skeins. Now, thank you. A ball of yarn is a little more convenient because you can knit from this right away. A skein of yarn, a little less so. You can tell it's a skein because when you open it, it's going to make a big old loop. You can't knit from this like this. You're going to have to wind it into a ball. There is some equipment, it's called the Swift & Ball Winder, that you can use to wind balls conveniently at home, but that's kind of expensive. You might not want to get into that when you're first learning how to knit. You can get a friend
like this
to hold the skein like that and then manually wind ball. Or sometimes in the store, you can ask them to wind it at the time of purchase, and many yarn stores, especially the finer yarn stores, will do that for you. For sake of convenience, you might want to just get a ball of yarn this time. Now, you can get either wool or acrylic for this project. I don't recommend cotton, and the other fibers tend to be a little more expensive than you're probably going to want to deal with right now, things like cashmere and silk. So stick to either wool or acrylic, and there are different advantages and disadvantages of both. The big advantage of acrylic, number 1, it's machine washable, easy care, and number 2, it's relatively inexpensive. The big disadvantage of acrylic, it's not waterproof, it's not as warm as wool, and it has that plasticky kind of feel to it. The big advantage of wool, it's naturally water retardant, it's very warm, and it tends to drape better. It's a little softer.
Well, isn't wool sort of like scratchy and really nasty feeling and stuff like that?
It used to be, but not today. Wool today is really soft and really wonderful. The only disadvantage for wool, unless it's superwash, you can't machine wash it or it's going to felt. and it does tend to be a little more expensive than acrylic.
Now, what if people say have allergies or can they swap out different materials or substitute or things like that?
Sure, acrylic is always hyperallergenic, but if you're working with a thinner yarn or a thicker yarn, bigger needles, smaller needles, email me or leave a blog comment. You can absolutely substitute, but it is going to be a change to the pattern. We'll get you set up. Just let me know so that we can work out the pattern difference.
Now, one more thing. Now, let's say we, of course, live in New York and are very lucky to be able to have yarn stores all over the place. What if people don't have a yarn store close to them within walking or driving distance?
There are general hobby stores like Joann's or Michael's, and they will always have yarn and knitting needles. There are also a great variety of wonderful online yarn stores, and I will post links to those in the show notes.
Now, why don't you tell us what we're going to do next week?
Next week, we're going to learn to cast on. We're going to learn several cast on methods, and we're going to learn just the knit stitch. We're not dealing with pearls yet. Now, we're not going to be releasing this podcast on a traditional regular schedule because some aspects of the projects are going to take longer than other aspects. If I'm asking you to knit 2 inches of ribbing on size 8 needles, I'm expecting that's going to be pretty quick. If I'm asking you to knit 7 inches of stockinette on size 1 needles, I'm expecting that's going to take a little while longer. So we're going to release an approximation to when people are going to be ready for the next step. And I'm going to ask if we're going too fast, if we're going too slow. Let us know and we can adjust.
And what is that email address one more time?
It's ivy@knittingstepbystep.com, or go to the website and leave a comment.
All right, this is the end of episode 1. This is Knitting Step by Step. I'm Jason Block.
And I'm Ivy Reisner. Thank you for watching.